I didn't scream when my life started falling apart. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't run. I stayed quiet. That's what makes this harder to explain. There was no moment anyone could point to and say, that's when everything went wrong. From the outside, nothing looked broken. From the inside, something essential was quietly collapsing. I had learned early that silence was safer than honesty. If you don't complain, people trust you. If you don't resist, people rely on you. If you don't ask for much, no one questions your presence. So I became someone easy to live around. Responsible. Calm. Uncomplicated. I wore that identity so well that even I forgot it was a mask. When discomfort first appeared, it didn't feel like pain. It felt like pressure. Like a room slowly losing oxygen while everyone inside pretended nothing had changed. I noticed it in small moments, when laughter felt delayed, when decisions felt automatic, when I couldn't remember the last time I had wanted something strongly. I told myself it was maturity. I told myself that intense feelings were for younger versions of people. That adulthood meant learning how to endure without fuss. That stability mattered more than excitement, and gratitude mattered more than truth. So I swallowed the discomfort. That became a habit. Every time something felt wrong but not urgent, I ignored it. Every time I felt the urge to speak up, I reminded myself not to be dramatic. I learned how to stay composed while parts of me quietly withdrew. No one noticed. That was the problem. Life kept rewarding my silence. I was praised for being steady, for not causing problems, for always managing. The more I endured, the more dependable I seemed. And the more dependable I seemed, the harder it became to admit that I was unraveling. I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I didn't want to destabilize the life I had built. So I stayed quiet while my needs shrank. I stopped naming what I felt. I stopped questioning choices that no longer fit. I told myself that unease was temporary, that clarity would arrive later, that I just needed to be patient. Later became my hiding place. Years passed like that. Not in obvious misery. In muted dissatisfaction. I functioned. I showed up. I kept promises. I smiled at the right moments. But inside, something was receding. I felt like a tenant in my own life, careful not to rearrange the furniture, careful not to leave marks. I remember the moment I realized how far gone I was. Someone asked me a simple question, "Are you happy?" Not aggressively. Not seriously. Just casually. And my mind went blank. I didn't know how to answer. Not because the question was complicated, but because I had trained myself not to think in those terms. Happiness felt irrelevant. Inappropriate. Almost selfish. So I answered the way I always did. I'm fine. The words came out automatically. Polite. Smooth. But later that night, alone, the weight of that moment hit me. I realized I hadn't lied to them. I had lied to myself for so long that I no longer knew the difference. That scared me more than sadness ever could. Sadness demands attention. Numbness disappears quietly. I started noticing how often I felt detached from my own days. How rarely I felt anticipation. How the future felt like a continuation instead of a possibility. Time wasn't moving fast, it was slipping through me without friction. I wasn't living badly. I was living quietly wrong. And the quietness made it easy to ignore. I stayed quiet through decisions that deserved resistance. Through compromises that chipped away at my sense of self. Through moments where speaking up might have changed everything, but also might have caused discomfort. I chose comfort for others over truth for myself. Over and over. The tragedy wasn't that my life fell apart dramatically. The tragedy was that it fell apart politely. No alarms. No witnesses. No urgency. Just a slow erosion of presence. I began to understand something painful: silence is not neutral. It shapes your life just as much as action does. Every time I stayed quiet instead of honest, I voted for a future that required less of me, and gave me less in return. I didn't notice when my life started asking less of me. I only noticed when I started feeling less alive. And by then, staying quiet had become second nature. I didn't know yet how to speak. I only knew that if I stayed silent much longer, there would be nothing left to protect. Once I noticed how quiet I had become, I couldn't stop hearing it. Silence stopped feeling peaceful. It started feeling deliberate. I realized I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because saying something would have changed things. And change, for me, had become synonymous with danger. I had built my entire sense of safety around not disrupting anything. Not conversations. Not expectations. Not the version of me people were used to. Every time I swallowed a thought, I told myself it wasn't important enough. Every time I felt the urge to object, to question, to admit discomfort, I reminded myself that things could be worse. That stability mattered. That being calm was a virtue. What I didn't see then was that calm had become a cover for fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of discovering that if I spoke honestly, I would have to act on it. Silence allowed me to postpone action indefinitely. But silence has a side effect no one warns you about. It turns inward. The things you don't say don't disappear. They settle. They accumulate. They harden into tension you carry everywhere without realizing it. I started feeling exhausted in ways sleep didn't fix. Irritated by small things. Heavy for no clear reason. I wasn't tired of life. I was tired of suppressing it. The breakdown didn't look like falling apart. It looked like a growing inability to tolerate my own days. Ordinary moments began to feel unbearable, not because they were painful, but because they were empty of choice. I noticed how often my decisions were automatic. How little intention I brought into my actions. I moved through routines as if they were obligations handed down by someone else, not choices I was responsible for. And the most frightening part? No one was stopping me from changing. I was stopping myself. That realization stripped away every excuse I had relied on. There was no one to blame. No external pressure strong enough to justify my silence. I had stayed quiet because it was easier than risking the consequences of truth. That truth hit me hardest in relationships. I had taught people who I was by what I tolerated. I had trained them to expect compliance, understanding, patience. When something bothered me, I smoothed it over. When something hurt, I minimized it. When something didn't fit, I adapted myself instead. So when I finally felt overwhelmed, I didn't know how to explain it. From the outside, nothing was wrong. And that made me feel crazy. How do you justify a breakdown when your life looks intact? How do you explain that the problem isn't what's happening, but what isn't? I started questioning my own legitimacy. Maybe I was ungrateful. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I was imagining things. Those thoughts kept me silent longer than anything else. I had internalized the idea that suffering only counted if it was visible. That pain needed proof. That if I couldn't point to a clear injustice, I didn't deserve to speak up. So I kept quiet. And the quiet turned into resentment. Not loud resentment. Quiet, corrosive resentment. It showed up as emotional distance. As impatience. As a numbness that made it harder and harder to care about things that once mattered. That scared me. Because numbness doesn't stay contained. It leaks. It drains color from everything. I began to feel like I was watching my own life from behind glass. Present but unreachable. Safe but disconnected. I could see myself making choices and wondered, who decided this? The answer was always uncomfortable. I did. By not deciding. That's when the moral dilemma became unavoidable. Was it more ethical to maintain peace by staying silent? Or to disrupt it by finally telling the truth? I had built a life where my silence benefited everyone around me. They were comfortable. Secure. Confident in my reliability. Speaking up now would feel like betrayal. But staying silent felt like slow self-destruction. I understood then that silence is never neutral. It always serves someone. And in my case, it served everyone except me. The night everything shifted was painfully ordinary. No argument. No crisis. Just a moment of clarity so sharp it felt physical. I imagined my future exactly as it was. Same quiet endurance. Same unspoken dissatisfaction. Same internal distance. And I realized I could survive that future. That was the most terrifying part. Because survival was no longer enough. I didn't want to endure my life anymore. I wanted to inhabit it. To feel like my presence mattered, not because I was useful, but because I was real. That desire didn't make me brave. It made me honest. For the first time, I admitted something I had avoided for years: staying quiet wasn't protecting me. It was erasing me. I still didn't know how to speak. I didn't know what words to use or what consequences would follow. I only knew that if I didn't break the silence soon, there would be nothing left of me to hear. The quiet had done enough damage. And whatever came next, conflict, loss, uncertainty, couldn't be worse than disappearing politely inside my own life. That was the moment silence lost its power over me. The first time I spoke, my voice didn't sound like mine. It was quieter than I expected. Unsteady. Not dramatic or brave, just honest in a way I had avoided for years. I didn't deliver a speech. I didn't explain everything. I said something small and true, and then I stopped. That pause felt like standing on the edge of something irreversible. Nothing exploded. That was the second surprise. The world didn't end when I broke the silence. There was no immediate collapse, no cinematic confrontation that justified years of restraint. What followed was subtler, and harder. Confusion. Discomfort. Distance. People didn't know how to respond to this version of me. The one who no longer smoothed things over. The one who admitted dissatisfaction without immediately apologizing for it. The one who didn't rush to make everyone else comfortable. Some tried to understand. Some didn't. Some preferred the quiet version I had been. That hurt more than I expected. Because it forced me to confront a painful truth: part of the connection I thought I had built was dependent on my silence. My calm. My willingness to disappear just enough to keep things easy. When that disappeared, so did the illusion. I questioned myself constantly in those early days. Wondered if I had overreacted. If I had mistaken discomfort for truth. If maybe silence really was the price of stability, and I had just refused to pay it. There were moments when I wanted to take it all back. Silence is seductive when you're used to it. It promises relief. It offers to restore the familiar. All I had to do was retreat, explain myself less, adjust more, become small again. But something in me refused. Not loudly. Not heroically. Quietly. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I had felt what it was like to be present, even briefly, and I couldn't return to being absent without knowing exactly what I was losing. Presence was uncomfortable. But it was real. I started noticing how much energy I had spent managing my invisibility. How exhausting it had been to constantly predict reactions, soften edges, swallow truths. Speaking didn't simplify my life, but it stopped draining it in the same way. I learned that honesty doesn't always bring clarity. Sometimes it brings consequences. Some relationships shifted permanently. Some expectations were withdrawn. Some versions of me were quietly mourned by people who never knew I was struggling in the first place. I grieved those losses. Not because speaking up was wrong, but because silence had once protected me from seeing how conditional some connections were. And yet, something unexpected happened. I felt solid. Not happy. Not confident. Solid. My thoughts stopped fighting my actions. My inner world stopped contradicting my outer one. For the first time in a long while, I didn't have to rehearse my life internally before living it. That alignment mattered more than comfort ever had. I realized then that silence hadn't been my nature. It had been my strategy. A strategy to avoid conflict. A strategy to avoid disappointment. A strategy to avoid the responsibility of being seen. But being unseen had come at a cost I could no longer afford. I had mistaken peace for numbness. Calm for erasure. Endurance for virtue. And letting go of those beliefs felt like waking up in a life I was finally responsible for. Responsibility is terrifying when you've avoided it for years. Because now, if something feels wrong, you can't hide behind patience. If something doesn't fit, you can't call it maturity. You have to decide. Again and again. There were days when I failed. Days when I retreated. Days when silence crept back in because it was familiar and easy. I don't want to pretend this was a clean transformation. It wasn't. It was messy. Uneven. Ongoing. But it was mine. I learned that speaking up doesn't guarantee understanding. It doesn't ensure approval. It doesn't even promise relief. What it does promise is presence. And presence changes how time feels. Days stopped slipping past unnoticed. Moments gained texture. Even difficult emotions felt preferable to the flatness I had lived in before. Pain hurt, but it proved I was still connected. I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn: a life doesn't fall apart only when it collapses. Sometimes it falls apart because you stay quiet while it does. I stayed quiet for a long time. Long enough to almost disappear inside a life that looked intact. Long enough to forget that silence is a choice, and choices shape everything. Breaking that silence didn't fix my life. It gave it back to me. If you're listening to this and you recognize that quiet inside yourself, the one that feels safe but heavy, calm but empty, don't wait for it to turn into despair. Don't wait for proof that your pain is legitimate. Silence doesn't protect what matters. It protects what's comfortable. And comfort, when it demands your absence, is too expensive. You don't need to shout to reclaim your life. You don't need to destroy anything. Sometimes, all it takes is one honest sentence spoken aloud, without apology. That's how my life stopped falling apart quietly. That's how I finally heard myself again.